Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field.
This show is brought to you by Automotive Seminars. If you're looking to stay up on the cutting edge diagnostic strategies and techniques, this is the place. You've got live 4-hour seminars that are put online that you can join in, ask questions, interact with the instructors with some of the best of the best. They've got Keith Perkins and John Thornton putting on classes like network diagnostics, mechanical engine testing, advanced electrical testing, and GDI diagnostics, and a ton more. And once you purchase one of these training seminars, you can access this at any time that you want through your account at automotiveseminars.com. You can rewatch the training a year, 2 years later, which makes this training even more valuable. So I highly recommend you check this out. The link is in the show notes.
Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I'll be your host once again for this week's episode. Don't mind my voice today if it's a little off, just recovering from a cold, but we're going to do this anyways. Today, I'm going to talk about something that we have been dealing with recently, which, of course, a lot of the time is what I talk about on the podcast. It's like, what are we getting calls on right now? What are shops challenged with? What are maybe we challenged with? And how do we deal with it? That's what I want to talk about here, and that's what this episode is. So what I'm going to go with today is module-to-module communication. And, of course, I talk a ton about networks and communication on the podcast. It is a recurring theme, obviously. Maybe you're tired of hearing about it. But, again, I'm basing the content that I put on the show off of what I'm seeing in the field and, again, what is most challenging. And today, like I mentioned, module-to-module communication. Not so much specifically network communication in general, although it is involved, and not so much scan tool to module communication, although it is involved. This is two modules on the car that need to share data in some way on some network, but there's an issue. So I'm going to give you a few different examples because it does depend on the car, the network setup, the information that's being transferred, all of that. Obviously, there's different situations. If there wasn't, this would be really easy if there was just one setup and we knew exactly what to do. But therein lies the problem is there's a ton of different configurations and setups and modules and brands and scan tools and network architecture. All of that is going to change from car to car to car, and we've got to deal with all of it if you want to work in the independent all makes and models. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're like, hey, I only work on, Europeans, or I only do domestic and Asian, or maybe I work at a dealer and only work on one brand. Even within that, I think you've got a lot to deal with, and you're going to see some variation. But I'm going to cover a few different ones here. And again, this is two modules on a car that share information, and one or both of them is presenting some sort of issue or code that is either causing a warning light, disabling part of the car, maybe the entire car, due to either no communication, a lack of communication between the two modules, maybe data that it's expecting but it's not getting, right? Maybe there's communication but it's an invalid data or a missing message between these two modules on the car. But we can talk to those two modules. And actually, I'll give you another example of a situation where we can't talk to one of the modules. But the one that we've dealt with on a couple different cars recently is two modules on the car. You can talk to them with the scan tool, but they are saying, or at least one of them is saying, that they can't talk to each other. And that's creating some sort of negative effect on the vehicle. Maybe it doesn't start, maybe a certain function doesn't work, maybe there's a warning light on the dash, whatever it is, right? That's the end goal, is to fix that. But we've gotten to the point with the initial scan and assessment of the vehicle is that, hey, one of these modules isn't getting what it needs from the other module, if anything at all. Maybe it's just saying, I got no comm with this module, but you can talk to both of them with the scan tool. Okay, now the other situation is a sub module that isn't meant to talk to your scan tool. Okay, so that would be something that is maybe on a LIN bus. There's proprietary CAN networks as well. We see these pretty commonly on GM stuff on modern vehicles, where they'll have an independent CAN network to like a fuel pump driver module, and you don't talk to that module on the scan tool. Maybe you can get data PIDs and information from it, but that's being transferred from the engine control module to your scan tool off of this proprietary network that you never touch it directly with your scan tool, is where I'm going with that. And that could be a LIN bus, again, can be a CAN bus. There can be these sub networks that don't touch the scan tool. And I mean, if you look at a vehicle with a gateway setup, which many manufacturers use, that's true of a ton of the modules on the car, right? You're talking to the gateway and it's transferring information to your scan tool. You're not directly talking to any of those modules on that particular vehicle. But I'm not so much going with the gateway thing here. I'm talking about, you can talk to this module and it's upset about another module, and maybe you can talk to that secondary one if it's on a network where that's possible, or maybe it's just on its own independent network that the scan tool will never have communication with it because it's not meant to, right? So different setups on different cars. But what you end up having is, again, one or more of these modules doing the Spider-Man thing at each other. The meme, if you haven't seen it, there's multiple Spider-Mans that are pointing at each other. Look it up if you haven't seen it. I'm sure everybody has. And they're saying, well, he's the problem. No, he's the problem. And I can talk to both of them. And that's where this becomes really challenging. Now, the first thing that you want to consider that might help you determine what's going on is looking at the network configuration on the particular vehicle that you're working on, and ask yourself, okay, well, how does my scan tool talk to these modules? And is that the same method or same network that these two modules talk to each other on? Okay, and a perfect example of this was the other day on an 07 Nissan Titan. It was immobilized, it wouldn't start, and you could talk with everything on that vehicle. All modules that were capable of talking to the scan tool did. However, it's a no start, it's immobilized, and if we scan it, we see a ton of U1000 codes. That's Nissan's thing. If there's a CAN network error, they just say, yep, U1000, we got a problem here. Not going to tell you what it is. You can do a little bit more with Consult, digging into the details of those codes, but if you're just using an aftermarket scan tool, actually, now that I say that, I think some of them do have an option to do like a CAN diagnostic. I haven't played around with it much on an aftermarket tool, so that's a separate discussion. But anyways, where I'm going with this is I can talk to everything, but just about everything on that car that lives on the CAN network is setting a CAN communication code, and clearly this vehicle is disabled for one reason or another. So how is that possible? How can I talk to everything, but everything can't talk to each other? What's going on there? This thing has two different networks. There is a K line, and now granted, this is an 07, so this is like right at the beginning of CAN networks. Yes, they used them in vehicles much earlier than 2008, but 2008 was the like, hey, everybody's got to do this for powertrain communication. 6 and 14, you got to have info there for, generic OBD2 standards. But 07 was right before that, and some vehicles were already using CAN. This is one of them. So if you look at 6 and 14, you've got your CAN network, and it's just your traditional like bus style CAN. And there's also a K line on that OBD2 connector, and I forget which pin that is off the top of my head. Maybe 1 or 7. Don't quote me on that. Anyways, it's a single wire network that goes to a number of the modules on the vehicle. And so I'm able to talk to those modules with the scan tool because of the K line, not because of the CAN bus. I ended up scoping the CAN bus. It was clearly open. And by the way, if you see traditional bus style like this. And what I mean by that is there's like a main branch of the CAN network, and then it has legs that go off to the module. This is not the daisy chain style that GM and others use, but this is your traditional bus style CAN. And if you look at the waveform of a CAN network, and you see your 2.5 volt bias, or you don't even need to see it. Put whatever measuring bar or indicator you have on your scope at 2.5 volts, and then look. And this is on one side of the network, right? You're grounding your scope on the body of the vehicle, and you're looking at one side. I don't care which side. If you look at it, you see 2.5 volts, and then it goes above and below on the same side of the network. You have an open. That's it. I've talked about this before on the show. That 100% is an open for it to go up and down. No, it's not shorted together, because then you would have nothing. They would cancel each other out, right? Now, here's the other important thing. When you have this, and this is generally going to be, there's an open on one side of the network. If it's both sides, you'll get a different waveform. It does depend on the network and where and how it's broken and terminating resistor locations. But if you have like both sides of the network completely disconnected, this will change. But one side of the network open, on the broken side, right, the side that has the open, you'll see voltages or data packets go up and they'll go down, right, up to 3.5, down to 1.5 on the same side of the network. Okay, and that's your indicator, like, hey, pin 14, this white wire, I know when I find my open, it'll be on this side of the network. And that's been very true for the CAN network diagnostics that I've done. Okay, so we saw that on this one. You look at the other side, looks like relatively normal data transmission. You can ohm check it. Okay, I got 120. So not only do I know that there's an open on this network, but I know it's somewhere between the DLC and one of the terminating resistors. ECM and IPDM on this Nissan have the terminating resistors, which is not an easy thing to find, by the way. So if you want to jot that down for an 07 Titan, it might save you a little bit of digging and service information. But ECM and IPDM have terminating resistors. Okay, let's go to those. And I ended up finding a pin fitment issue at the ECM. That case study is not really what I want to go in depth in on this episode, right? But it was an open CAN network. But I was able to talk to everything else, even though there was a major communication issue. Now, the other module, or the modules on that vehicle, importantly, like the body control module, the IPDM, the ECM, those involved with immobilizer functions, communicated important information over the CAN network. They were not able to do that because it was open at the ECM connector. But I was able to talk to all of them using the scan tool. Now, if you didn't understand network construction, you didn't look at the diagram, you don't have a reference for how this stuff is working, you would be very confused about all of these communication codes that all of these modules have. But I can talk to everything. Very strange, okay? But it has to do with how does the scan tool interact with these modules on this vehicle, okay? And that's just one example. That might not be true of a 2008 Nissan Titan, because then is, that CAN protocol defining that you have to talk to the ECM, TCM through the pins 6 and 14. I don't know. I didn't have an 08 sitting there to compare, but I know for sure I could talk to all the modules on this network, and I know for sure I had an open on the CAN at the ECM. So there's no way I was talking to that ECM, even though there was one side connected. The high-speed CAN that this one uses is not the fault-tolerant version that I think some of the slower speeds can use, where you can still talk on just one side. It's not the case on this one. I was talking to it through the K-line, the single wire network. Okay, so where I'm going with that is you need to understand, how does my scan tool actually talk to the module I'm talking to? And then in addition to that, how do those modules talk to each other? Is it the same? In this case, it wasn't. And you might find that on some other vehicles, is they have their own independent network that is separate from the way that your scan tool communicates with them. And for vehicles that have multiple networks, this is very possible, right? You could have a body controller or any sort of gateway module, really, but a BCM is the one that comes to mind in a lot of cases, that is connected to every network on the vehicle, and there's 3 or 4 different networks. Okay, Now, you might be able to talk to it with your scan tool, but one of the networks it's connected to might be down, might be affected in some way. So you'll have communication codes in there, but again, it's how does your scan tool reach out to it? Another real quick example is if you look at a lot of Ford vehicles that use the gateway module that is the OBD2 connector, and if you look at the diagram, you'll have a couple buses, right? These vehicles will have like 4 different buses. They'll have 3 high speed and a medium speed. And a couple of the high speed will be directly connected to the pins, the female pins on the OBD2 connector. So you are hardwired in. You could scope those right at the DLC and get usable information. But then there's 2 other networks that go into the backside of this module. That's what it is. It's a gateway. And you're not directly connected to them with the scan tool. And you would have to go to the backside of that module to scope those networks. So again, where I'm going with this is you got to understand network architecture, construction on the vehicle you're working on, where those modules are in reference to those networks, and then how does that all play together in the situation that you're dealing with? And it's not always the easiest thing to answer because they might just not come out and tell you that these 2 modules talk on this network for sure, and your scan tool talks to this module on this network for sure. I actually find that to be the case a lot of the time is it doesn't come out and tell you which network your scan tool is using to communicate to a specific module if there's multiple paths for that to happen, right? And when I say multiple paths, like conceivably this body controller on this Cadillac, I could be talking to it on the low speed GM LAN pin 1, or I could be talking to it on the high speed CAN 6 and 14 because they're both connected to the DLC and they're both connected to the body control module. Well, which one is it when I'm reading scan tool information out of that body controller? Which one am I using? I don't know for sure. Right? Sometimes you might have to take a guess in certain circumstances if they don't just come out and tell you. Maybe they do, right? Look in service information, and sometimes you can deduce which one is the network based on network architecture, but not always. But back to vehicles where we have module communication issues, but we can talk to everything properly with the scan tool. We dealt with a few of these recently, so I'm going to go through these. First one is a 2012 Porsche 911. This one was setting codes in the airbag control module for the passenger's seat presence module, if you will, or sensor. I forget the terminology they use specifically, but it is a module that goes underneath the passenger seat, and it's connected to the actual mat sensor to detect if somebody's sitting there or not. And this module, the passenger presence module, does not talk to the scan tool directly. It is a LIN bus that goes from that module to the airbag control module under the center console. Okay. And we had communication codes with that airbag module and with the and we had communication codes in the airbag module saying, hey, I can't talk to the passenger presence module under the seat. All right. So we looked at this and we ended up, it's a very simple circuit at the passenger presence module. It's got power, it's got ground, it's got LIN, and then it's connected to some sensor wires. Okay, easy enough. Check power, check ground, check LIN. It all seems to be good, right? We're using a scope to check the LIN. Everything seems to be present there. We tell the customer to get a passenger presence module. They do. We put it in there. Same thing. Okay, so a little bit more investigating here. What we didn't do when we checked that LIN bus the first time was check it while it was plugged into the module. We did that, and what we ended up finding was the LIN bus looked okay on the scope. I was using an EU scope when I looked at this. Until you plugged it into the module, then it dropped down to nothing. There was no communication. And so at first I was thinking some sort of short in the module. Does this have something to do with the sensor? It didn't. I ended up finding if I was touching the metal part of the probe that was connected to the LIN bus, and I unplugged that passenger presence module, and I took my other hand and I touched it to a metal surface on the vehicle, like the frame for the seat, I could actually pull that waveform down right there.
Hey, have you ever been faced with the challenge of sourcing, installing, and programming a used control module in a vehicle? I know a lot of us have. It seems to be happening more and more often today with the volume of control modules on vehicles, the cost of some new ones, or even the availability of new control modules. In some cases, used may be the only option. So what do you do here? I strongly recommend checking out SJ Auto Solutions and Tommy Oliva. Tommy offers a cloning service for used control modules to make these things plug and play for the vehicle that you're working on. In a lot of cases, he is also able to source the control modules if you're unable to locate one for the vehicle that you're working on. But once you get connected with Tommy, he's going to offer fantastic support from start to finish to make sure that that control module is going to work in your application. He's also got tech support that he offers through his website, along with some free resources there as well on information about used control module programming. So make sure to check out SJ Auto Solutions. I can't recommend that enough.
Just me, through my body, 1,000,000 ohms of resistance, and that was enough to pull that LIN bus down to almost nothing. So what's happening there is we've got some sort of issue going on with either the circuit or maybe the circuit inside of the airbag module, but we had to get to the airbag module, remove the center console. It ended up being a pin fitment issue at the airbag control module for that LIN bus. And so it was pretty easy to miss because, again, the LIN bus looked okay just looking at it open circuit, but connected to the module, that pulled it down. Again, you could pull it down pretty easily just by touching the circuit with your body and correcting the pin fitment at the airbag module where it was just barely touching, right? That pin fitment was creating some unwanted resistance, if you will. And open circuit, okay, yeah, we can still read the voltage. Any sort of load, which a LIN bus shouldn't really have a ton of load, but any amount of load was enough to pull this down and make that circuit unusable, causing my communication code, okay? Now, this is one where the airbag control module, we have to rely on that to give us information of like, hey, I can't talk to this module. We can't go to the airbag or the passenger presence module and check for it. Does it communicate? Because the scan tool doesn't have means to talk to it. It was never set up to talk to a scan tool, right? This little passenger presence module was only set up to talk to the airbag module, and vice versa between the two on the LIN bus. So we have to actually analyze what's going on that network using a scope. And that's kind of where I'm going with this is when you get into these situations, one of your only weapons here in order to make the right call is analysis of the network between these two, right? Once you have identified, okay, well, how does data transmission happen between these two modules in question? Well, okay, well, how do they transfer information between them and on what network? And then once I know what network, well, what is that network supposed to do? Right. And it's a LIN bus. And so, we would expect to see a LIN bus up towards battery voltage of the vehicle and then be pulled down for data transmission. And the other interesting thing about this after the fact, with a little hindsight, I didn't pick this out in the moment, but that the resting voltage for that LIN bus when there was still an issue was lower than battery voltage. So again, resistance at that pin fitment, and I'm sure just connecting my scope was somewhat of a load on that circuit, right? And if you've been doing this long enough before, you've seen that where your measuring device can act as a load in an instance where there's high enough resistance in a circuit, usually unwanted. But right, you've got high enough unwanted resistance. So even though your scope or measuring device is not meant to take much load or take much current from the circuit, it does a little bit, a very small amount. That's how it performs the measurement. And in those situations, the tool alone can be enough to affect the circuit. And I think it was a little bit in this one, didn't pull it all the way down. But anyways, being able to assess that network was what allowed us to get to the fix on that one. All right, the next two that I want to talk about, and these are strangely similar as far as the results of the vehicle and the modules that we're dealing with, and both, in my opinion, very difficult to make an accurate call on. We basically got down to a 50-50 on these. Now, I say that, and I don't mean that it's impossible to be able to pick it out, but I think without a known good in front of you, it would be very, very challenging, especially in the moment, to make an accurate call. You're going to get it down to the two modules, and you can do your due diligence for, like, you know, powers and grounds checks to these modules, and we did. And I'm kind of excluding that from this conversation, right? Let's just assume that we've checked all the powers and all the grounds and all the necessary connections to a given module, but we still have these communication issues between the two of them. We eventually got down to a point where it's like, yeah, it's data shared between these two that is the issue, but we don't know which module is at fault, right? Again, they're doing the Spider-Man thing, pointing at each other. And we got to call one of them what is the most likely. Unfortunately, in both of these vehicles, we made the wrong call. And that's kind of why I'm talking about it, right? I don't talk about the easy ones on the podcast. That would be really boring. Like, oh yeah, we found a missing fuse. Or, oh yeah, that corroded wire was, you know, causing an open. You guys get really bored of listening to that really fast. I want to talk about the stuff that is challenging and difficult, and it is really tough to make an accurate call. And unfortunately, that 50-50 call went the wrong way on both of these. And we're going to fix them, and we'll eat whatever cost is involved, and we will take, this is sidebar, but in those situations, you have to collect data so that it doesn't happen to you again. That in the off chance you run into this same scenario again, or maybe you know somebody else who runs into this situation, you have the data to say, yep, this is what good looks like. This is when it was bad. Here's what you checked for, and you can make more of an informed decision. Well, going into it, really didn't have it available to us. So let me set the scenario here. The first car is an 07 Subaru Legacy. It is immobilized. There seems to be an issue with communication between the body integrated unit, which handles the immobilizer data, like it actually reads the chip and the key, and the engine control module. And we have a code in the engine control module saying, I don't have any communication with the body integrated unit. And eventually, if you try starting this thing enough, you also get the same code in the body integrated unit as, I don't have any communication with the PCM. Now, these particular codes aren't CAN codes. They refer specifically to two circuits that go between the two modules just for immobilizer data. Now, interestingly enough, on these data lines that look very much like a LIN bus, although they're not defined that way in Subaru service information, there's two circuits, but they are redundant, or one is redundant. And it lists that in the diagram. It says there's a main communication and a backup communication. So without a whole lot more explanation from Subaru, I can surmise from that is they have one circuit. It's like, hey, here, let's transfer immobilizer data, and then we'll give it a backup just in case something happens to that main circuit. Okay, so right there, if that's true, it's very unlikely it's a wiring issue, but maybe still could be two wires open, or maybe a connector, right, that's affecting both circuits if they're close to each other, which they were. But let me get in here and see what's going on. Now, I see communication on both lines between the ECM and the body unit, and it looks the same on both sides. Now, what I did see here, and I'll put a picture of this in the Facebook group if I remember. Sometimes I forget to put those up. But in the data transmission, it does not appear that the data packets are being pulled all the way down to zero all the time. And I that stood out to me immediately of like, oh, okay, this is a problem. And I checked the wiring first because I'm already at both of these modules. Or I went to the ECM first, then I went to the body unit. And I checked the wiring between the two of them, and it's good. There are no issues. Both wires can handle a load from one end to another. There's not a pin fitment issue. Okay. So then it's got to be one of these modules that does not seem to be able to pull this all the way down to 0. Okay. Now, in that case, you definitely want to check grounds for the module in question because, what's a module going to use to pull a data line down to 0, a ground, right? It's going to need that. So, okay, we'll check the grounds. We did that. Well, now it's basically down to, okay, well, which module is the problem? So what I did was I separated the network on each end, right? So unplug it from the BCM, look at the data line. I unplugged it from the PCM and I looked at the data line. Here's what I found. On the PCM side, like the PCM still plugged in and I have the BCM unplugged, I get that same data packet where you see it's not pulling it down to ground. It's like a distorted wave at the bottom. And that's coming from the PCM for sure. There's nothing else on this network. I'm like, okay, well, the PCM's definitely having trouble pulling this down to ground. And so then I unplug the engine control module and then I plug in the body integrated unit and I cycle the key and I look at it and there's actually no traffic on this one with the ECM unplugged. I'm like, okay, well, maybe the ECM's the master, maybe the ECM needs to talk. And so based on what I saw, I was convinced the waveform that I saw was the issue. And I told him to get an engine control module. I said, this is the one that looks like it's just having issues, not being able to pull these lines down to ground. It was the same on both lines. I'm going to say get one of these. And again, check powers and grounds. All that stuff's good. He gets one. We put it in. It's the same problem. So we're actually waiting on a body integrated unit right now to see if that takes care of it. I don't know if there's something between the two of them that needs to happen inside the body integrated unit in order for that waveform to look okay. Maybe the waveform I'm looking at is normal for that circuit. I can't say I've ever scoped the immobilization circuit on one of these 07 legacies before. I kind of doubt that's how it's supposed to look like. But again, maybe there's something in the BCM that is, open, not connected, and it's affecting the way that looks. That's possible. I made my best judgment call in the moment, and it ended up being wrong. Luckily, those used ECMs on these things aren't very expensive. So it's not a terribly expensive guess, but it is a waste of time. And, we don't like doing that. But it's one of those scenarios where, it's 50-50. I'm going to use my best judgment here. Okay. So I'm still waiting for that one to get fixed. I will report back and let you know what fixes that vehicle. Next one, we're still waiting on getting fixed, is a 2001 Jeep Grand Cherokee. Like, these are not new vehicles either. And so you might be like, well, why are we talking about all these old vehicles? Well, these sort of problems exist on modern vehicles too. I've got a 23 BMW where I don't even have enough information to talk about it on the podcast, but that's another one. I've got data transfer between two modules that isn't adding up. But again, I'm not going into that one because I don't have enough info just yet to even talk about it. So this is relevant, even though I'm telling you about an 01 Jeep Grand Cherokee. It uses a PCI bus, which is a single wire data transmission. It pulls up instead of down, otherwise very similar to what you would see on a LIN bus. But PCI bus has its own standards as far as data transmission and voltages and all that stuff. I think it goes up to about 8.5 volts when it's pulled high for data transmission. Well, this one's also immobilized. This one also has codes in the PCM saying it can't talk to the SCIM module. And there were other communication codes with this one as well. There was also issues with the scan tools talking to specific modules at times. And we ended up calling the SCIM module. So I was working with one of my employees. They were going through it. We really tried to be as thorough as possible. We got to like, yeah, I think it's between the SCIM and the PCM. That's where we got to it. And we decided to call the SCIM module because I think at one point it had set a code for the SCIM module. It said like internal fault or something to that effect. I apologize. I wasn't at the car. I was working with my technician over the phone on this one, but we decided, hey, let's put a SCIM module in this and see what happens. We do the SCIM module, and it was a bear to get this thing initialized and set up for the vehicle because there was still a problem and it didn't fix it. And now we're going for a PCM, but we have a little bit more ammunition here because, you know, we're getting more invested in this. We're really looking at all the details. Like, okay, well, what can we prove to say like, hey, this module is the issue? And again, this is where this data is huge. Had I seen this or had this knowledge or been able to compare it to this ahead of time, maybe we could have picked it out. But there was a waveform on the PCI bus when you'd unplug the PCM and then plug the PCM back in, and you can see the data corruption. It is very subtle, but if you look at it, it's there. And what the PCM is doing on this PCI bus is it's outputting a single pulse, if you will, right? It's pulling up the network for just a brief period of time. And that happens every 5 milliseconds as long as the PCM is plugged in. Now, here's the problem. It does that consistently as long as it's plugged in, including when other modules are trying to talk on the bus. You can see it interrupt these data packets every 5 milliseconds, which is the reason we were having scan-to communication issues, the reason we were having programming issues for the SCIM, and most likely the reason that this thing is not starting is that even though we can talk to the PCM, right? Yes, there's glitches in the data. If you watch the data stream, it'll come in and out, but we can talk to it. It's not offline, and it's setting code saying it can't talk to the SCIM module, but the PCM appears to be polluting the PCI bus on this one. So this one's not fixed either. We got a PCM coming. I think we're going to do that Monday or Tuesday to get that one fixed. But these are the types of situations that I'm talking about when there's module to module communication about some particular information, and we've got to make a determination of like who is at fault, right? And we see this even just with invalid data. Maybe it's not a no-com, but it's like, I don't like the information that module is giving me. Well, I don't like the information that module's giving me. Like, who is at fault here, right? You could have a wrong module installed or wrong calibration installed, and you would get one of those. You could have a configuration issue between two modules and get that where it's like, hey, I'm not getting the right data from this module. He is the problem, but really it's that, you know, module B is the problem. I don't like the data he's giving me, but it's because module A didn't have the right configuration or wasn't the right part, right? Another scenario where we see that module communication being an issue. So these are not easy problems to work through. This can be very challenging, as I've described here, kind of kicking our butts lately, but again, why I wanted to talk about it and put it out there. Maybe you're dealing with some similar issues. So if you are, let me know. I'd be curious to know your thoughts or experiences with stuff like this. How do you get through it? Do you just get to a point where it's a 50-50 and you got to make a call? Or like, how deep do you go into it to try to make that determination? It's tough, especially when you're doing it mobile. Very difficult sometimes to make informed decision on stuff like this. But we're going to keep trying. We're going to keep documenting, build up that database of information that we can use. So anyways, hopefully you enjoyed that, found that interesting, maybe learned something, maybe you can share something based off of that. But with that all out of the way, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.